Ambassador Shapiro has been the coordinator for Cuban Affairs, has been a part of the U.S. State Department for many years. He has, in the last year, taken 5 trips to Cuba. He knows that country well. And he's also the president of the World Affairs Council in Atlanta, Georgia. Please help me welcome Ambassador Charles Shapiro.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. This is great. And thank you all for coming tonight. This is coming out in the evening after you've worked all day or been in school all day is always a challenge, I know, and I appreciate it. Tell me the time. When am I? How long y'all want me to talk for? Because as Richard Howell knows, I can talk forever. So I'm going to put a timer on, and hopefully, because what I'd prefer to do would be to answer questions from you. I want to thank Dixie Anderson, who is the executive director of World Affairs Western Michigan, for inviting me to come here. And we've worked together closely, World Affairs Atlanta with World Affairs Western Michigan. And I want to thank the President of the United States for having gone to Cuba last week and making all this work real well and getting this in the news. So thank you very much. There are students who are great decision students, right? Here, somewhere? Some of you? Can anybody tell me where this is? Anybody know? Student or non-students. You've been to Cuba. Where is this? This is the old Capitol building in Havana. It's across from the Parque Central. And who's in the statue on the right, Dean? Some guy. Okay. Anybody know? Jose Marti, who is the father of Cuban independence. And on the left, obviously, is the Cuban flag. Their capital is modeled after our capital. Looks remarkably similar, except as they say, ours is 6 feet taller than yours. And in fact, it is. That stuff counts apparently. So here, the president was in Cuba last week. And there was some great discussion about whether or not we should go ahead with this policy, whether we should, in fact, have normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba, and whether the president should have gone to Cuba. I was convinced that we should normalize relations. I was not convinced that the President of the United States should go to Cuba until he went, because I think he hit the ball out of the park. And this photo, I think, exemplifies that. So you've got relatively young, to me, very young, President Obama with very old President Raul Castro, the younger brother of the duo, who's only 84 years old. And at that press conference that they did together, I think our president handled it masterfully and made Raul Castro look exactly like what he was, a guy who's out of touch, who couldn't answer the questions from the media that were not the questions that had been written in advance and which he had agreed to, and broadcast live in Cuba, and I think he did a terrific job. Fidel Castro, the older brother, published today in Granma, the official party newspaper of the Communist Party of Cuba, pardon me, I'm just getting over a cold, I apologize, a letter addressed to Brother Obama, okay, in which he takes apart what President Obama had said in the speech that he gave at the Grand Theater, which actually was right next door to the Capitol building in Havana. And in just this really goofy way, talks about what the president said and how President Obama was wrong about this, and this that he said about Cuba. The best thing that I saw, at least on my Facebook feed today, was a friend of mine who's a professor at NYU said he sounded like when your crazy uncle comes to Thanksgiving dinner and just goes on a rant about something, and in fact, that is exactly that just typified it perfectly. The other thing that's interesting, I'll note for y'all, is that Obama being African American made a big difference to Cubans. Because, in fact, it stands in stark contrast with the leadership of Cuba, which, while it is a majority Afro-Cuban nation, is overwhelmingly white. The Communist Party leadership, the ministers in the government, the military leadership are overwhelmingly white. And I think that just sent a strong message to Cubans. And if y'all read the press carefully, you saw a lot of that because Cuban said, he looks like me. He looks like me. He's a guy I can talk to. He's a guy I want to talk to. This is not going to be one of these things where I'm heaping praise on Cuba, and I hope that's okay. I think we're doing the right thing to open relations with Cuba, because I think what the United States wants to do, first of all, is have normal trade relations with Cuba, export U.S. products to Cuba. But I think what we also want to do is to help push change in Cuba. In Cuba right now, it's changing in Cuban terms. Richard, I think you'll agree, it's changing more rapidly than Cubans thought it would. But in terms of what needs to be done, it's glacial. And so that, in fact, is one of the things that makes Cuba such a fascinating place to visit and to study. And it was encapsulated really well in the reading in The Great Decisions that I know everybody in the audience tonight must have read. So the Cuban economy is stuck. It's been growing at around 1.2, maybe 2% a year. The data is funky, so nobody's really sure, nobody outside of Cuba is really sure how fast it's growing because obviously all the data is government of Cuba data. One reason is the U.S. embargo. I think everybody knows that since 1963, there's been an embargo against Cuba that it's changed a little bit over time, it's evolved, but essentially what it does is it says it is illegal for U.S. business to do business in Cuba, to invest in Cuba, to import from Cuba, to export to Cuba. And we're the natural market for Cuba. We're 90 miles away. And to cut off access to the United States, in fact, has severely hurt the Cuban economy. But what has hurt the Cuban economy even more is communist economics, which don't work in Cuba any more than they work in the Soviet Union or worked in China or worked anywhere else for that matter. They just flat out don't work. And that's typified by central planning by the ministries who run everything and decide not whether things are going to make a profit, because there's no profit, but, pardon me, by the output. So things are measured by outputs, not by inputs, and not by the result is the output. So that's the measure. And then the other thing that holds Cuba tremendously is infrastructure essentially stopped changing in 1959. January 1, 1959 is the day that the previous government of Batista fled the country, that the troops of the guerrillas entered Havana, and the infrastructure that Cuba is using now is essentially 1959, mainly U.S., but not exclusively U.S. infrastructure. So what you see in this picture is Havana Harbor, and what you see going over Havana Harbor is that big black cloud of smoke, which is from the oil refinery, which used to be the Gulf Oil Refinery, which is, cutting edge 1959 technology, way out of date technology now. Almost every bit of infrastructure in Cuba needs to be replaced. So just to give you an idea on the economic side, the economy of Cuba is equivalent to the economy of metropolitan Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, the total economy of Cuba is equivalent to the economy of metropolitan Hartford, Connecticut. So here's some data. The population's 11 million in Cuba. GDP is 81 billion. The standard metropolitan statistical area of greater Grand Rapids is about 52 billion. So it's almost as big as we're two-thirds the size of the Cuban economy. So the closest I could find in the U.S. is Hartford, Connecticut. The Dominican Republic is the benchmark that we ought to all be looking at. Because Dominican Republic, Caribbean nation, similar climate, similar soil, similar products, including tourism and tobacco, and its economy is twice the size of the Cuban economy. They're still not wealthy. It's not a wealthy country, but it's doing way better than Cuba is. And that's what we ought to be looking at. The future of Cuba, I think, is the private sector. In Cuba, they call the people who run businesses cuentapropistas. It's a Spanish word which doesn't make much sense in Spanish outside of Cuba. Cuenta propia means you're on their own account. So they're people who are working on their own account because their ideology doesn't allow them to say that somebody's an entrepreneur. They can't say that somebody's a business executive. So the best that they can bring themselves to say is they're cuentapropistas. There are about 500,000 people who are cuentapropistas. The people who own the businesses and the people who work inside those businesses. Most of them are personal services, like this shoe repair guy here. This gentleman does automobile restoration. I mean, that's what people get excited about, of course. He does 1950 Chevrolets is his specialty. He loves it. And for those of y'all who are old enough to remember that right there, whoops, let me go back. Right there is a Craftsman lathe that was his father's. His father was a Chevrolet mechanic, and it's the lathe that his father used that still works. Pre-1959 infrastructure. The woman on the right in front of the pink car is the automobile restorer's wife. He restores the car, she runs the business. He restores the cars, she puts them on the road, not as taxis, but to contract with your group is coming in, right? So I need 5 cars to take people around. She'll contract with you to do that. And I'm going to assume there's nobody here who's a reporter for any Cuban newspapers. It's against the law to own more than one vehicle in Cuba. And they have 22. And the way they have done that is the wife owns one, the husband owns one, their 10-year-old son owns one, and all their cousins technically own a vehicle. The woman on the left runs a factory. The factory consists of 3 sewing machines, 3 employees, one of whom works at a store, making baby clothes and selling them not to foreigners but to Cubans, because what she says is the quality of Cuban baby clothes is not up to what she desires, and so that's why she's got this little factory. This is in her house, by the way, her apartment. But she's made enough money off of this that she was able to trade what she thought was a not-so-good house in a bad neighborhood for a better house in a better neighborhood. She actually is an architect by training. And so they gutted it, and they did all the work themselves, upgrading their house. I need to back up here for a second and tell you something. One key point that I left out is that the average wage in Cuba is $23 a month. Okay? That's the average is $23 a month. Doctors make more. Surgeons make more than doctors who aren't surgeons. And there are a lot of people who make less than $23 a month. That's how it becomes the average. This guy, young man, Sergio, develops apps. He's working on something right now that's close to WhatsApp. He hopes to make money off of it. Actually, he's got another job. He does this part-time. These guys are lecturers. Some of you who've been to Cuba may have seen them or listened to them. The gentleman on the right is a professor of economics at the University of Havana, who explains what's going on in the Cuban economy, how it's working. The gentleman on the left is a retired Cuban diplomat. He was their ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. taught at their diplomatic academy, and then after he retired, taught at the University of Havana. They give lectures for about $100 to $150 each. The guy on the left, you'll see him, he'll give 5 or 6 lectures a day. So he's doing just fine in a country where people make $23 a month. But if you ask him, are you in business? His answer is no. I mean, he doesn't think of that as business, but in fact, he is. The entertainers, the gentleman on the left is actually a pretty amusing street entertainer, hanging out where the tourists are because that's how you make money, is getting tips in there's 2 currencies in Cuba in the hard currency that essentially is equivalent to dollars. The guy on the left is half of a hip-hop duo they're the leading rappers in Cuba right now. The name of their band is Obsession. You can Google it and see some of their videos. Services. The gentleman on the left, the bald guy, is a hairdresser. Runs a beauty salon. And also collects old-fashioned, old-timey barber shop stuff, including old-fashioned, those things ladies used to put on their head to dry the hair. It's very cool. The guy seated in the chair is the mayor of Atlanta, Kasim Reed, whom I took down there last July. In the photo on the right, the woman wearing the black blouse runs what's called in Cuba a paladar, a private restaurant. And this is one of the best ones. If anybody's going to Havana, I'll tell you the name and where to go. She does a terrific job. But there's a limitation. There are a number of limitations, but the most important one, I suppose, is you can only have one restaurant, and it has to be in your house. So you can't rent a place to have a restaurant, okay? And you can't have more than one. I mean, I assume in Grand Rapids, whoever's the best restaurateur in town probably has 6 restaurants all over western Michigan. You can't do that. The woman in the blue blouse to the left in that photo is an event planner. She puts on quinceañeras. She puts on birthday parties for children. She puts on weddings and retirements, and when your uncle comes to visit from abroad and you want to put on a party for them. I mean, it never occurred to me that there would be a need for event planners in Cuba, but obviously there is. She was a professor of economics at the University of Havana. She left and now has 20 people working for her on contract. So the clown for the birthday party or the photographer for the quinceañera. Does everybody know what a quinceañera is? Yeah, okay, good. The photographer for the quinceañera or the makeup person for the quinceañera, whom she contracts to come in, and so she'll do the whole thing. She said when she left, her colleagues couldn't believe that she would leave such a prestigious job, being a professor at a university, to go run a small business. And now she says they're calling her up and asking her for jobs. Here's a telling point that you'll appreciate. I asked her when I was there in April what was the hardest thing she'd had to do since she had opened her business. And she didn't really answer. And I was back in July with the mayor and sat next to her at lunch and asked, and she says, I've been thinking about the question you asked me ever since April. And she says, the hardest thing I had to do was fire somebody. And she said, but Shapiro, you don't know why. Here's the deal, is nobody in Cuba has been fired since 1959. Seriously, for not doing their job. People have been fired for political reasons, but nobody's been fired for not doing their job. And I had to fire a woman who was the wife of a friend of mine who was stealing money. And she said, it almost killed me to do it. I mean, that's like historical, should be one of those signs out front, in bronze. Artists, there are artists in Cuba, just like you would imagine. I mean, it's a tremendously talented artists, interesting society, interesting art. The gentleman on the left, his name is Edel Bordon. He's a painter. The woman to the right, Jamile Pardo, is a sculptor, his wife. He bought his apartment. I said, how much did you pay? He told me the amount in Swiss francs. Well, why would you buy an apartment in Havana for Swiss francs? He said, well, because I just sold a painting in Switzerland. Okay, and his work, he says his best sales are in Boston, in a gallery in Boston, which I think is pretty cool. The place on the right is an art gallery, bar, happening, hi-fi, Wi-Fi hotspot, coffee bar, in a huge old factory building, and it's actually pretty cool. And they're farmers. These guys are tobacco farmers in the western part of Cuba, in Vinales, making the tobacco that goes into cigars. You've been to that very farm. Good. Did you smoke that very leaf? I did. You may have. Okay. They don't own the land, though. They don't own the land. The only people who own the land, the only farmers who own the land are farmers from before the revolution who didn't leave, who were allowed to keep a certain number of acres, and they actually own the land outright. All the other farmers have, there's some lawyers in the room, it's called usufruct, right? You remember that in first year in law school? They have the use of the land, but they don't own the land. So they have the use of the land. They can't sell it, they can't mortgage it, but they have the use of the land for the way that the leases are written, as long as the land remains productive. And so this guy, Benito, the gentleman on the right, I mean, he's just excited as can be. He says, well, the road's right out there, and I'm building a second tobacco barn, and I'm making money. And the way that he makes money, they have to sell 90% of the tobacco to the state tobacco monopoly. But he's making the money off the 10% that he gets to keep. He rolls the cigars and sells them to tourists for $1 each, and he's doing just fine, thank you very much. So now here's some comparisons. Right now, the United States exports $299 million a year to Cuba, mainly in exclusively of agricultural products. In 2001, in the Bush administration, the embargo was amended to allow U.S. to export agricultural and medical products to Cuba. I don't think they bought any medical products, but they do buy agricultural products. At one point, it got up to over $1 billion. Now it's around $300 million. But to keep that in mind, that $300 million is what we export to Canada every 9 hours. Right? Every 9 hours. So that's my talk on Cuba. I'll be glad to say more. Thank you very much. I've finished early. We can all go home. I'd be delighted to answer questions. There's a microphone here, and Erica's ready, so you want him to come down? You want him to shout it out? How does it work, Erica?
Yeah, it's Johnny on the spot right here. So we have a couple of different options. You can either come down to the microphones, or you can text your questions to the number on the screen. But first and foremost, thank you so much, Ambassador Shapiro.
Thank you.
I think there's just so much food for thought in that very quick overview of Cuba as it stands now. And what I really appreciated was just your highlighting of Cuban people and what the texture of life is like for them, especially the Cuenta Propistas. They seem to have a very different understanding or a different way of interacting with the economy than what we're used to in a capitalist culture. So thinking about moving forward for Cuba, what will need to change in the mindset of Cuban people to become prosperous as a nation, but also for people individually?
Thanks, Erica. That's a great question. I mean, the first thing is right now, Cuba's losing population. The population of Cuba is declining every year for two reasons. Number one, the birth rate is just every country in the world is you increase educational levels, birth rate drops off. But the birth rate in Cuba is 1.6 children per woman on average, which is obviously you need to have two to be at the replacement level, right? And so part of it is that is a declining birth rate, but the other part is an extraordinarily high immigration rate abroad. And so what needs to change is, and I think the Raul Castro and the leadership in Cuba understand that. What needs to change is they need to make Cuba prosperous enough that people want to stay and not leave. Because what's happening, I mean, two points to keep in mind, just to make sure everybody knows this, if you read the reading, is that education in Cuba is free for the student. Education in Cuba is free for the student through graduate school. And healthcare in Cuba is free to the patient. I mean, all medical care is free to the patient. Not free to the state, because obviously it costs money to run the hospitals, but it is free to the patient. So you've got an aging population with the number of workers per retiree is declining. And so how do they maintain what they consider to be really the crown jewels of the Cuban Revolution is education and healthcare. So how do you maintain that if you don't have enough workers paying in and if your economy's not growing? And that's really what they're wrestling with right now. And the other face of that is the number of people who are leaving. I give long answers to short questions, I apologize. The woman in the photo, the young woman who's running the event planning business, went to the most elite high school in the country. It's actually the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin High School in Havana. It's a magnet school. You have to take a test to get into it. And typically, the graduates from that school, go to the best universities and then end up, after graduating from university, they end up being the staff assistant to the minister of this or the whatever. I asked her, and she said that she's in her mid-30s. She said of her class from the Lenin High School, that 70% of the graduates are living outside the country. Now, that's the best, most elite school in the country. I mean, they are the beneficiaries of the benefits of the revolution, right? They've left the country. So that's what the leadership is facing right now. I mean, and you can actually, they're wrestling with that. What do we do? How do we make this country more attractive? How do we make the economy grow faster? How do we make it, Cubans are very proud of Cuba. How do we make it so the Cubans want to stay in Cuba instead of leaving and going elsewhere, whether it's to Miami or Madrid, Rome, where there are large Cuban colonies. So that's what they're facing right now. I will have part of the answer in mid-April. Obama came this week. Mick Jagger came to Cuba this week. But in Cuban terms, more important is April 18th to 21st, I think, is the 7th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party. And it will lay out where the country is going for the next 5 years. And so how they do that and how they decide where to go is, I think, we'll see that in the results of the Cuban Communist Party Congress. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Hello. I've read about a special immigration statute that gives preferential treatment to people who leave Cuba and who are going to come into the United States, and this is causing friction with Cuban leadership, but also the surrounding countries who then have to host temporarily the people who are fleeing Cuba. Could you explain this phenomenon a little bit, please?
I can describe it. I'm not sure I can explain it. With a lot of U.S.-Cuba relations, that's the problem. In 1966, during the Johnson administration, Congress passed a law. I'm going to underline a law, not an executive order, a law called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And they are operating off the parallel with the Berlin Wall. Is that when East Germans jumped over, and some of you in the audience will remember this, would jump over the Berlin Wall to West Berlin, you obviously weren't going to throw them back to East Germany. And so our Congress and our president at the time made the same parallel to Cuba. Is that Cubans who are escaping this communist dictatorship in Cuba, how can we send them back? And so they passed something called the Cuban Adjustment Act, which says that if Cubans reach U.S. soil, all they have to say is that they're fleeing political oppression. We parole them in, not we, in the collective we, the Immigration Service paroles them into the United States. They have the right to work after a brief interview. And then after 1 year, they get a green card. They are the only country that has that privilege. And so, as you can imagine, there are people who think that should be changed. There are other people who insist it should be the same. It shouldn't change. Almost every Cuban knows about it. And there's been a spike in immigration from Cuba this year to the U.S. because they're worried that the Cuban Adjustment Act will be changed. And so they want to make sure they get here before it's changed. So you've got this, public policy isn't easy anywhere, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. So what does the United States do? Does the United States change that? While it's being debated in Congress, there will be a flood of people leaving Cuba and trying to get to the United States before the law is changed. Do you leave it the same? And what the Obama administration said is, we have no plans at the present time to change the Cuban Adjustment Act. Because one of our interests under both Republican and Democratic administrations is that there be safe, orderly, and legal immigration from Cuba to the United States. Is that we don't want people in jury-rigged boats taken out across the Straits of Florida and thousands of them dying on the ocean. You want to follow up? I can tell. Yes, sir.
I'm a retired Foreign Service officer.
Uh-huh.
And I spent 4 years in Cuba from 1956 to 60.
Wow.
I started out as a visa officer, because I was a young officer at that time. And the number of Cubans that would be at the American embassy in the morning wanting a visa was huge. And I'm wondering, how does Mr. Obama and the folks in the State Department feel about if the law gets to the point where Cubans can come in? I think you've just touched that for a little bit. They'll mob the country. You won't have any people left in Cuba. They'll all be up in Miami. So I'm wondering, I don't know if you stay in touch with the State Department.
I do, but I can't speak on behalf of the State Department, I'll tell you that.
I don't.
And Secretary Kerry hadn't called me lately.
I'm a lot older than
Yeah.
you are, so I don't have any friends there anymore. But I'm watching Mr. Obama down there, and my first thought is he aware, I'm sure they are, that there will be a mass exodus to the United States if they're not careful?
The short answer to that is yes. I worked on Cuban Affairs during the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. And we practiced periodically scenarios. working together with the Coast Guard and with Navy on what would happen if this, that, and the other happened, and there's a mass exodus from Cuba.
Yeah.
You know, how would we handle it? What would we do? And
I'm thinking about this.
yeah, and I would assume that President Obama, as part of the briefing books they gave him before he went to Havana, is very aware of that. What's changed, though, what I think is interesting is, thank you very much for the question, and thanks for serving there in some very difficult times. And I can't even remember what the heck I was going to say, but it was brilliant. Something about Cubans coming here. What's changed over time is that the people who left Cuba right after the revolution in 1959 were the wealthy. Then in 62, 63 to 65, you got a huge exodus of the middle class from Cuba. Not the wealthy, but middle class. And not exclusively middle class, but overwhelmingly middle class. The people who are coming now from Cuba aren't political opponents of the government. They're people who are looking for a better life. So in that sense, they're not different from Haitians or Dominicans or Sri Lankans coming to the United States. I mean, there are people who are looking for a better life, but who don't necessarily have a political grudge against the government of Cuba. I mean, and I don't have data to support it, but what you hear anecdotally is that people will go to the United States, spend a year, get their green card, get a job, get benefits, because you're entitled to social benefits in Florida, get those social benefits, and return home to Cuba with the flat screen TV to give their family in Cuba to show people how well they've done in the United States. And so, I mean, that's quite different. And again, how you handle that and what do we deal with it and how do we change that law? Should we change that law? If you were to change that law, how would you do it in a way that doesn't attract more people is a great challenge.
The ambassador is quite right. When Fidel first came in, the visa section was swamped with very well-off Cubans. And to be a Foreign Service officer, a visa officer at that time, I was offered paintings, dogs. One of the men said, I've got one of those poodles. He said, I've got a bunch of poodles that are really they've got good pedigrees. He says, I'll give you the poodles. He says, I hate to leave them here. So when you go back to the United States, you can have the poodles. Well, of course, as a Foreign Service officer, you're not allowed to accept anything from anybody for a visa. So I'd have to say, hey, yeah. I'm sorry about the dogs. I'd really like them, but I don't think I better do it.
That's great. Yeah, Erica, so you've got a texted question.
I've got many texted questions, and all I have to say is that would be a hard thing to pass up for a dog. That would be a hard bribe to pass up. A lot of people have been asking about the political climate of Cuba and the U.S. A little bit about how you see the Castros really, if they will, give up their power, how that succession will go, and what the implications are then for the U.S.
Okay. The answer is they say they will. Okay, is that Raul Castro says that he's going to retire in 2018 when his term is up. Is that true? Is that not true? Let's take him at face value. I mean, he said it enough times publicly. He is 84 years old. So, I mean, I believe him. They've got a succession, one thinks, that's lined up with First Vice President Miguel Diaz-Canel is in line. If things work the way they've always worked in the past, the first vice president becomes the president. In a one-party, in an election with one candidate. So, if it comes to that, he will be elected. But is that really going to happen? I don't know. I mean, and here's the hard part. Those of you who are my age remember criminologists. And during the height of the Soviet Union, people would, look for clues among who was standing next to whom at speeches and at parades in Moscow. And what you've got is the same thing now in Cuba, because Raul Castro doesn't give interviews. He doesn't allow academics to come spend hours with him. None of the Cuban leadership do. If they were, they'd be fired by Raul. So we don't have any insight into their thinking beyond what they say publicly. Maybe he gave some insights to President Obama. That I don't know. So how that goes on, will that change relations with the United States? It depends on what comes afterwards. I don't know how you work that out. Having diplomatic relations was announced by President Obama and President Raul Castro in December 2014. That's within the purview of the president. According to the constitutions, the president decides what foreign policy is going to be. The executive branch decides. But the embargo is law. The embargo, I'm going to repeat that again, just make sure everybody's got that. It's law. The president can't change it. The latest iteration of that law is from 1996, the Helms-Burton Act. It was passed by both houses of Congress, Republicans in Congress, but signed into law by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. So it had bipartisan support. We've sort of got this idea now, the Republicans are on one side and the Democrats are on the other, and that's not true. Richard Holwell will tell you that. There's a mixture with Democrats and Republicans, both in favor and against changing the law. But it means that your member of Congress, whatever district y'all live in, my member of Congress, a majority going to have to get together to do that. I think that the embargo should be lifted, because with that embargo, what we're doing is helping Raul Castro by giving him an excuse for why the economy doesn't work. Because what you're doing is you're hurting 11 million people to try to get at the government. That is very inefficient and doesn't work real well. What's the next question? How are we doing on time? Oh, okay.
Thanks for coming, first of all.
Thanks.
Baseball question for you.
All right.
I mean,
the Atlanta Braves is the answer.
Is there any possibility down the road that you think they could integrate into professional baseball in the United States?
Well, they are. Well, first of all, Cuban players are.
I'm talking about in the traditional way, not.
Yeah, I think so. People are working on that now. I mean, at least until now, what's happened for a Cuban to play in the United States and keep the money,
right,
they have to literally leave Cuba, flee Cuba, and come to the United States, and then stay in the United States, and they can't go home to Cuba. I think they'll find some way to change that. And part of that's up to Major League Baseball. Right. Part of it's up to visa status and those sorts of things. The government of Cuba has agreed that Cuban baseball players, would have to pay tax and so forth, but essentially could keep their money if they were to come back to Cuba.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. That's what we do with players in the Dominican Republic and Venezuela and Japan. Why should Cuba be different in that regard? Yes, sir.
Dr. Shapiro.
I'm not a doctor.
Ambassador Shapiro.
There you go.
Your lordship.
That's even better.
That better?
Keep going. You're on.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
Good. Good. First of all, a quick one. The barber that you had in your picture, is his name Robin?
No.
Oh, okay. We hung out with a Robin that was a barber that was
No, this
bald
guy's
for
name,
7 days.
he goes by the nickname Papito.
Babito, okay.
Which means little daddy. And I don't know what his real name is, because all I've ever heard is Papito. And I think it's Valladares.
Okay.
Here's the interesting thing about him. His parents live in the States. He could go to the United States legally with a visa. He has decided to stay in Cuba. And I think it's really, good for him.
Okay. The barber that we hung out with for about 7 days down there November, and a lot of his friends are convinced that the Castros want the embargo to continue as long as possible. They call it the block.
The blockade.
The blockade, because it gives them a boogeyman.
Sure.
Someone to point to say, this is why, it's because of the depredations of the United States, this is why we have the decrepitude in the country, because they will not let us grow. So that was kind of a new thing for me, and I didn't know what your comment was on that.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, their public line is they want the embargo to be lifted. Right. I mean, it would make it easier for their economy. I mean, look, right now, if you think about comparative advantage, think about your econ course you took your freshman year in college, right? Cuba's comparative advantage is tourism. In economic terms, tourism is an export if the tourists are foreign tourists, right? So if a German tourist eats at the restaurant that Dixie and I ate at last night, the cost of that meal is actually an export to Germany. When Dixie and I ate there, it's not an export. It's just two people having a great meal. But tourism is where Cuba has a comparative advantage. And that would be U.S. tourists coming in. I mean, everybody else can come already. I mean, it's not like, Canadians can't get there or Germans or Mexicans can't go to Cuba. They can. But, we're this huge market of 350 million people who, by and large, have not been able to go to Cuba. So people, just like people who want to check off, I've been to Nepal, now I want to go to Cuba, right? People want to go. They want to see what it's like. And Cuba has got this very romantic image in the United States. And, I want to be absolutely clear. Havana is an extraordinary place. Old Havana is one of the most amazing places you will see. It's a beautiful country, and part of it is our own ignorance. And I hate to say that, but Americans as a nation, in my view, are ignorant about Latin America. But that Havana, which was founded in 1519, the city, is this extraordinarily beautiful city in the Americas, designed by Europeans, built by Europeans. And it is absolutely phenomenal. And just to give you an idea, we all learned in school about, the Spanish were busy collecting gold and silver from Mexico and Peru. They centered the gold and the silver in Havana Harbor so that the fleet could come from Spain and escort the ships with all the gold and silver back to Spain. Because this was in the age of pirates. Honest to God, pirates, corsairs. And so all that wealth was centered there in Havana. And so you see the most fabulous buildings, churches, monasteries, public buildings in Havana. It's worth the trip. Yes, sir.
Well, on that note, along with other people that don't want the embargo, is that I guess I'd like to ask a couple real estate questions. One is that other Caribbean tourist industries and landowners are very opposed. They're in favor of keeping the embargo, and they're very. The rest of the Caribbean is quite fearful of what would happen when Cuba opens up, and I think so. You would agree with that. Just wondering if your comment on the status of the land claims of the people that left, and whether you think that eventually things will open. I personally think this embargo has not served our interests at all, because the people. How do you change the attitude of the people? Is you open things up and they'll want to stay and build their country. They still love it. But what about those old land claims? But there are a lot of people there who want to see some development, but they do not want to see kind of the crassest aspect of American culture and the kind of greed and concentration of wealth that we have. So could you just comment on the whole prospect for real estate development in Cuba, including those land claims?
Okay.
If there's anything to them at all.
Okay, we may have to go get a drink after this to talk about. When in 1961, the government of Cuba started expropriating businesses and land from foreigners, they started expropriating homes. You were allowed to have one house. So if you had a house and a beach house, you lost one of them. They outlawed real estate as a business. So if you owned 6 homes in Havana and you were renting 5 of them, you lost the 5 you were renting, right? I mean, so there's a whole bunch of claims. In addition to which, there was a huge amount of U.S. investment in Cuba, correct? So that, the electrical system was built by U.S. electric companies, the bus company, the refinery, all the public utilities, a lot of it was owned by U.S. investors, not out of the goodness of their heart, but to make money.
Yeah.
Yes?
You can't imagine, the ambassador's exactly right. You can't imagine the amount of trouble we had shortly after Fidel took over. The ambassador, by that time I was in the economic section. The ambassador called me up and he said, Jerry, we've got to have somebody in the embassy who will talk to the Americans who are losing their property. He said, I think you should be the guy to do that.
Oh my God. No wonder you have white hair.
I have never had such a bad year in my life because you remember we had a Spanish-American War around the turn of the century.
1898.
And some people stayed there from America, and they had land. I remember an old lady came to me, and she brought me a passport from 1920. Mm-hmm. And she said, they're taking my farm away from me. And I said, well, are you an American citizen? And she said, yes. And she put this passport down on my desk. And I said, didn't you ever acquire Cuban citizenship? And she said, no. So day after day after day, I had people coming in asking us to stop the Cubans from taking over their land. Well, we can't do that.
Right.
It's a sovereign country. If they want to do it, we can't stop it. And as you pointed out, they own the telephone company. Hershey had a big central there.
Coca-Cola plant there. Big Coca-Cola bottling plant.
And the electric company was American. Just about everything the Americans had a hand in down there. And if we're talking about now, if they begin relations again, there is going to be. Are you still active in?
No, I'm retired.
You're fin. Well, somebody in the State Department is going to have their hands full, because I don't think the Cubans are going to relinquish that property.
No, of course not. No. Okay, so let me talk about that for a minute. I mean, and thank you for great stories. I mean, here's the deal: there are U.S. companies that lost major investments in Cuba. They've written it off their income taxes long ago. Most of them would be delighted. Hilton would be delighted to get back into Cuba, and I'm sure be willing to write off the Havana Hilton, okay? But then you've got a separate class of people who are just ordinary citizens who owned a store, a hat store, a toy store, who had a house that they lost. And their descendants, at least some of them, are going to want to be compensated for that. So your question is, what do you do about that? You can figure it out. My analogy is Prague. If any of you have been to Prague, in the Czech Republic, they actually had three different systems for compensating people for claims, right? Depending on who took your land. So if it was the Nazis who took your land, your property, there was one set of claims and one process for paying people. If it was the communists who took your land, then there was another system that they used. If it was the Czech government that took your land because you were an ethnic German in the Czech Republic, there was yet another system. So, I mean, you can work it out. You just have to sit down and figure it out. And frankly, that's what lawyers are for. As to preserving what's there, I mean, that's up to them. I mean, we can give them advice. You know, we can send down professors of urban planning. But at the end of the day, that's up to them. Right now, I mean, you see it and you go, my gosh, there's no strip malls, right? Nothing's been torn down to put up a drugstore with a huge parking lot around it. And, you know, there's no fast food chains, you know. And it seems very appealing to us who, you know, we put up with that every single day. But they're going to have to figure out, do they want to be Myrtle Beach or do they want to be Charleston, right? And I would argue that, you know, we've figured out how to do it in Charleston. Which if you have not been to Charleston, y'all need to go. It's one of the most fabulous cities you'll ever see. And so that we've been able to, too many buildings were lost, but colonial Charleston is still there. Myrtle, you know, so I mean, those are the two extremes, Myrtle Beach and Charleston. Okay? Yes?
We've got a few more questions, actually many more questions that were texted, so I'm going to lump them a bit together. Talk a little bit about the economy since we're on that track. Thanks. I'm a shorty. The underground economy, and I think the Cuento Propistas kind of skirt that line perhaps a little bit, but also issues of corruption. Can you speak to what's going on there?
Okay. So on the underground economy, I mean, first of all, you're talking about illicit activity, so there's no data. You know, that's the deal with stuff being illicit is it's illegal, right? And so nobody reports it. But the sense I get, first of all, just, I mean, Cuba is an economy that is MacGyvered, right? I mean, they keep things going with, you know, chewing gum and baling wire and duct tape, and things work remarkably so. Given what the lack of spare parts for everything. Loads of the Cuento Propistas are legal. They have to get licenses from the government and they pay taxes. So I mean, what they're doing is legal, at least in theory. I mean, that's not to say they're all paying the right amount of tax, and you know, but you know, in theory, what they're doing is legal. But what you see now in Cuba is, I mean, what you saw at the end of the Soviet Union, you know, the joke in the Soviet Union was they pretend to pay me and I pretend to work. And that's, in effect, what's going on in Cuba right now, is that people feel that it is their right to steal stuff from work. You know, I'm not getting paid enough, so I have the right, you know, if a light bulb burns out at home, I'll take one from work and take it home and use that light bulb. People take stuff and resell it. People think nothing about saying, I'm going to the doctor, saying go stand in line for 2 hours because there's a rumor that a particular product is available at a particular store. Is that corruption? Yeah, it would be in the United States. Certainly illegal in the United States. It's fraud and abuse under U.S. law. Is there high-level corruption? I can't answer that question simply because I don't know. I mean, every other country I've ever been in, including the United States, there's high level of corruption from time to time. We've got several former governors of Illinois are in jail, don't we? So my guess would be yeah, but I don't have any data to support that. I'd be willing to bet you money that I mean, I'm sure every building inspector and health inspector in Western Michigan is honest, but you know, I'd be willing to bet you that the people who go and inspect the private restaurants, or at least some of them, are on the tape. I mean, they must be. They must be. Yes, sir.
Hi. I got a quick question about the, can you talk a little bit about the Afro-Cuban, African-American relations, on how the this new relationship with Cuba is kind of gonna, I guess, experience or reach back to some lost history or lost culture from Africa before the embargo happened?
Okay, that's a great question. And I'm not an expert, but I know a little bit about it. First of all, since it was the middle class that left Cuba, the middle class was predominantly white. So Cuba went from pre-1959 being a majority white nation to today being a majority Afro-Cuban nation. So, I mean, the very nature of Cuban society is changed by the immigration abroad of 2 million Cubans, which is kind of interesting. Under the revolution, there's no racism. I mean, so, who gets into school is the person that gets the grade. And they actually did a remarkable job of incorporating everybody into the school system and everybody in the healthcare system. Thank you. I mean, it is, the guy who is the artist, the guy with the beard, he said his father was a sharecropper, that his dad did not know how to read, that there was a school in his town because after the revolution they built a school in his town, right? But without any connections, he went to the art school in Havana and graduated from the most prestigious arts. Okay, so I mean, there's more and more and more of that. So you see that. On the other hand, the elite in Cuba today, the government elite, the Communist Party elite, is overwhelmingly white. So, how do you square that? I think while universities are open to everybody, the students who get into university are disproportionately white. I'm not smart enough. I don't know enough about it to be able to answer your question. And what's that going to mean with the African American community and the Afro-Cuban community? President Obama referred to that, and I thought it was very interesting in the speech that he gave, where he said, we have shared history, that we both, Cuba and the United States, have a history of slavery and slave masters, right? And I don't know that anybody's ever talked about that like that in Cuba. And the fact that the President of the United States is African American, I think has a huge impact in Cuba. But what does that mean for relations between the two communities? I don't know, and in part because the Afro-Cuban community is not organized, right? There's African American organizations that you can list, where you can talk to the leadership. That doesn't exist in Cuba. And that brings me to another point that goes way beyond what you were talking about, is there are no non-governmental organizations in Cuba, except for the Catholic Church. But with that one exception, there's no PTAs, there's no Boy Scouts, there's no neighborhood associations to pick up trash and clean up your neighborhood that is not controlled entirely by the government. And so there's no Afro-Cuban organizations to promote the rights of Afro-Cubans, as far as I know. So, I mean, it's like you've got an organized community in the U.S. that doesn't have a counterpart to talk to in Cuba. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yes?
Well, this has been a great conversation. We have time for one more question, and I think it's a good one. Thinking about if we continue to normalize relations with the U.S., how is that going to, will it seriously threaten the current political party, or will it continue to be business as normal? What are your predictions?
I'm sorry, you got to make that clear. You lost me a little bit. I mean,
oh, sure.
Which party, where, in the U.S. or there, in Cuba?
In Cuba.
Okay. There's no polling in Cuba. I mean, nobody knows. So, how popular is the Communist Party of Cuba? I don't know. Here's what I do know, is there's no opposition party in Cuba, right? Not only are there no non-governmental organizations, there's no political organizations. So what it means by definition, anybody who opposes the government of Cuba is a dissident. I mean, we don't have that concept in the United States. If you don't like the government in Washington, you're called a Republican. I mean, you're called opposition. You're not called a dissident. And when George Bush was in power, the opposition were the Democrats. We don't have the concept of a dissident. So you've got these people who are self-proclaimed dissidents, who are very brave people, but who under really trying and difficult circumstances, how much of a following would they have, if it were a free system, if they had access to the media, if they could give speeches and write articles and get them published? I don't know. I mean, it may turn out that they're irrelevant. It may turn out they're mainstream. I don't know, but there's no way of judging. What I do know is that the right to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly do not exist in Cuba. So you don't have that at all. What I saw on Twitter today, I'm a addicted tuitero, as we say in Spanish, a Twitterer, but I saw a little video clip where there is a woman who is shouting, "Abajo los Castro," down with the Castros. I mean, on a corner, she's shouting, "Down with the Castros." Police car pulls up, okay? The neighbors come out of their apartments to defend her against the police. I have never seen that before. I mean, now, maybe it's just somebody was there with using their cell phone and it's the first time and it happens all the time. I have never, ever seen that before. So what's going to, let me go back to an analogy. I mean, Cuba right now is trying to figure out how to go forward, how to make their economy work, how much to change or not change their political system, whether or not they should. I mean, if you're an American, we pride ourselves on being pragmatic. Although I've got some questions about that right now. We would think, well, yeah, of course you want to copy what the Chinese and the Vietnamese have done. Thus far, they have been very careful not to do what the Chinese and the Vietnamese have done. So the best analogy I can come up with, do y'all remember when you were a kid and you went to the swimming pool and your older brother made you go up on the high dive and you're like 8, 9 years old? At least I can remember that. I assume everybody else had a similar experience. And you get up there and you look down and you go, oh my God, right? And you can't decide whether to jump or whether to go back down the ladder. And that's where Cuba is right now. They're at the top of that high dive, and they can't decide whether to jump or go back down the ladder. And that's why this is a fascinating time to be watching Cuba, looking at Cuba, and visiting Cuba. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, what a great finale to our series. Thank you so much. You're so personable and so engaging. We appreciate your great insights tonight. We all have one unasked question that I'm sure we all have, highly important. Can we now buy imported Cuban cigars?
If you go to Cuba, you're allowed to bring back up to $100 of cigars or rum or a mixture of the two.
Okay.
Okay, so you can bring them back legally if you go to Cuba.
Okay.
But apparently what you can't do is go to Canada and buy $100 of Cuban cigars and bring them back. Okay?
So it has to be from Cuba.
It has to be from Cuba.
All right. We have that question answered. Awesome. Thank you so much.